Imagine you're 60 years old with 2 million in your retirement portfolio. You're probably starting to ask yourself if you can retire, and if so, how much you might be able to spend. This is the exact situation today's couple is going through. They've been so focused on investing and growing their assets that they never really took the time to stop and think about when they might be able to retire and how much they might be able to spend. So today we're diving into Ken and Beth's actual financial situation, going through all the different planning techniques to help them reach their retirement goals and show them what's needed to get from where they're at today to where they want to be in the future, while at the same time considering all the different possibilities along the way. Now, whether you have $2 million in your portfolio or a completely different amount, the framework I'm about to show you works regardless of how much is in your portfolio to determine when you can retire and how much you can spend. So we have Ken and Beth sample, and they are both 60 years old. As of today, Ken has 900,000 in his 401k, and Beth has 650,000 in hers. They have a joint investment account of 450,000, 30,000 in savings, and then they have their home worth $670,000. So total net worth of 2.7 million, 2 million of which is in investable assets. At this point in their life, they're now asking themselves, when can we retire? And when we do, how much can we comfortably spend so that regardless of whatever happens in the market or whatever happens with inflation, we can feel completely secure that we're not going to have to go back to work or potentially run out of money. So, whenever we go through a financial planning process with a client, we always start with an understanding of what do you want retirement to look like? And this will be different for everyone. The way we optimize their investments, their taxes, their insurance plans, it all starts with their priorities and their personal goals. So when we went through this with Ken and Beth, we just started asking some basic questions, like when do you think you want to retire? Now, Ken and Beth always thought they were just going to work to age 65 because that's the typical retirement age. They were doing well with their investments, but didn't really know what they'd do for health insurance before age 65. So we started with an initial retirement age of 65, and we agreed to explore other ages just to see what's possible. The next question, of course, is how much do you want to spend in retirement? Which, to be honest, is a very difficult question for a lot of people to answer. Now, for Ken and Beth, they kept track of their expenses on a spreadsheet to help us understand what they're actually spending and how their spending today might change in retirement. And that number came out to be $5,500 per month, excluding things like the mortgage, debt, or insurance payments. Now, the next thing that we need to plan for is insurance, because a common question that many in Ken and Beth's situation have is, what will my annual healthcare cost be in retirement? Now, if you're going to retire past 65, then the first thing to figure out is what's an estimate of how much you might pay out of pocket. So after Medicare Part B and Part D premiums, which they'll both be one expense based on your adjusted gross income, and then outside of that, any supplemental coverages or any out-of-pocket costs, we assume $4,000 per year, which is pretty close to the national average. We also wanted to know, if you do end up retiring before 65, you're not going to have access to Medicare yet. So the big question becomes, how much do you need to plan for per month to get that coverage that works for you based upon where you live? For Ken and Beth, we estimated that would be about $1,000 per month for each of them. So a total of $2,000 per month or $24,000 per year they need prior to getting on Medicare. Ken and Beth also love to travel with the family, so we started to ask, what extra amount do we want for trips? And I prefer to actually separate this travel expense out from the rest of their expenses, because rarely does anyone travel the same exact way at age 65 compared to when they're 80, right? So this allows us to be more specific in how long this expense will take place in the plan and how much we'd like to budget for. They were looking at 3 to 4 trips a year at around $3,000 each, so they wanted to dedicate $10,000 total per year for travel. If they could do that for the first 10 years in retirement, they'd be really happy. The next thing we looked at was their family. Now, family was really important to them, and they had some concerns if their children were able to put away some money for their grandchildren's future college needs. So Ken and Beth said, one thing that we love to be able to do is help with that. Could we help pay by funding 529 college plans so that our children don't have to take on all the pressure of trying to pay for a mortgage, pay for the bills, while at the same time trying to save for their kids' future. How can we help? So we didn't know exactly what that looked like, but we added it as a goal for now with no specific number attached to it yet. Now, in a little bit, I'll show you how we can play with the numbers and these goals, dialing them up or dialing them down to see what it could look like if we help them save, let's say, 5,000 per year or 15,000 per year for college costs. Because the last thing we want to do is overcommit to this goal, to one day become a burden to our children and put our own retirement at risk. So we'll come back to this one. The next thing we do is look at their income. So Ken's salary is $150,000 per year, and Beth is earning $100,000 per year. As we look towards the future, Ken's Social Security benefit at full retirement age would be $3,100 per month, and Beth, if she retired at 65 and started collecting at 67, would be $2,400 per month. So those are their income sources. And if we hop over to the savings area, Ken and Beth are both currently maxing out their 401ks and plan to do that until they stop working. So those are the details, while at the same time we are assuming an annualized growth rate of 6.5% per year starting today and throughout retirement. Now, when we pull all that information together, we can ask ourselves, is this realistic to retire at 65? Is it realistic to spend what we want to spend? And based upon that, can we make adjustments to see what happens if we were to retire earlier, if we were to spend more in retirement or spend less? What if we get a higher rate of return on our investments, or what if it's lower? These are all different scenarios we can start to play out and take a look at. So let's start with our cash flow in retirement. Here's what this looks like when we put it all together. This is the retirement cash flows page, and probably one of the most important areas we pay the most attention to because cash flow drives everything. So we first have income in the first column, then there's expenses, goals, and taxes. And on the far right, there's net flows, which is the amount needed from your investments to fund your expenses in retirement for that year. So let's start with income. Both Ken and Beth will have their salary for the next 5 years until retiring at 65. Then they'll have 2 gap years until Social Security kicks in at age 67 and several months until they reach their full retirement age, at which point they'll receive almost $72,000 in Social Security income their first year in retirement. Now, let's now compare that to what we can project their expenses to be. So if we go to the expenses tab and living expenses, we can see that number starting at $66,000 and is adjusted every year at a 3% inflation rate for pre-retirement and throughout retirement. And remember, these are the core living expenses. This doesn't include the mortgage, property taxes, insurance premiums, or loan payments because that's calculated elsewhere within the system. Now, in addition to that, they also have housing expenses. Now, in this case, their mortgage is already paid off, but they still have property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs on top of the core expenses at $5,500 per month. Then there's healthcare expenses. Now, up until they retire at 65, they are covered under their current employer, but after that point, that's when Medicare starts. And that's what it looks like when they have Medicare premiums for Part B and D, and out-of-pocket costs, or possibly supplemental coverage if they need it. So what this allows us to do is have control over the timing of these expenses, when they come into play, and how we can make adjustments along the way for things like medical expenses while factoring in inflation. Then on top of that, we factor in their goals. In this case, their travel expenses for the first 10 years of retirement. And so you can see we're accounting for that and including inflation along the way. So for Ken and Beth, they don't have to second guess themselves on whether or not they can take another vacation this year or next year. They can be confident in knowing they are financially able to do it because they've already been planning for it, right? And what this does is give them more peace of mind to be able to spend their money in retirement, but on their terms, without feeling guilty or stressed out if it'll negatively impact their plan. So that's their travel goal. In addition to that, we look at projected tax payments. For the first 5 years, they have a higher tax payment because they're still working, but then the taxes drop off for a few years until required minimum distributions begin at age 75. So when we zoom back out and fast forward to the first year of retirement, we have our income or total inflows, then our total expenses, goals, and projected taxes. Total these up, and that brings us to our total outflows. Now, the difference between what's coming in and what's going out is the last column, net flows. So, in their first 2 years of retirement, there's no income and no inflows because Ken and Beth aren't working. So there's no salary and Social Security didn't start yet. So all of their expenses, plus travel expenses and taxes, would need to come from their portfolio. So first year in retirement, they'd need to pull 118,000 and in year 2, 122,000 from their investments. Then when Social Security kicks in, that amount significantly drops to 56,000 in order to maintain their standard of living. So as we're looking at all this, we start to ask ourselves, is this sustainable? How much do I need from my portfolio relative to how much am I projected to have in the future? And this is really important to know because that allows us to benchmark if we're taking an amount that is sustainable from your portfolio or not. For example, if you're taking 10% from your portfolio to live in retirement, that's probably not a sustainable withdrawal rate over a long time horizon, right? Versus if your withdrawal rate was 2 to 3% of your portfolio, that's much more sustainable, again, over a 30 plus year time horizon. And so this takes us to the next step to figure out what is your projected portfolio going to look like and what's a withdrawal rate that would be sustainable for your retirement. Well, if we look at your portfolio, here's the starting balance. Here's how much they have in planned savings for each of their 401ks. And then there's the employer match for both plans. Now, for the portfolio return, that's based on an assumed growth rate of 6.5%. So, what the software does is model 6.5% every single year on the portfolio, which is completely unrealistic. It's very unlikely you'll get the same return every single year just due to market fluctuations. However, we always start with a linear projection and then stress test it by using what we call Monte Carlo analysis. And what this allows us to do is get a range of returns in any potential sequence and stress test the plan by saying, what if we got very bad returns followed by slow growth? Or what if we had a bad decade followed by slow growth? And so, what this allows us to do is model out actual scenarios that have happened in the past. But just to be very clear, we're looking at something that says you are assuming a growth rate. And for the base model, this is a general projection of where your portfolio might end up by the time they retire. So, if we take these assumptions plus our planned savings, employer match, and portfolio returns for the first 5 years, Ken and Beth are going to retire with 3.4 million in their portfolio. So now we have two really important pieces of information. We know exactly how much they'll need from their portfolio every year throughout retirement based on the projections, and we know how much their portfolio will be at retirement. So now we can start comparing the two and figure out, will this provide a sustainable withdrawal rate to last throughout retirement? So let's jump over and see what the withdrawal rates would need to be to support this plan. And what we can see here is based on the amounts that they'll need to take out in retirement, their first and second year is projected to have a 3% withdrawal rate, which honestly is a very comfortable rate for me. And then it drops because that's when Social Security kicks in and they won't need to withdraw as much from their portfolio to maintain their standard of living. Now, what we see for Ken and Beth is their withdrawal rate jumps back up at age 75, not because they're spending more, because the required minimum distributions start to kick in, forcing them to take more and more from their portfolio. And this is when we start to transition into tax planning and have a conversation around how can we minimize taxes when taking those required distributions, because they're all counted as taxable income. And I've done some videos on this already that go much more in depth on the tax planning. So if you haven't watched those yet, I'll include links in the description to those videos and you can check them out later. Now, With that being said, Ken and Beth are expected to have 11 to 12 million in their 90s. Even with a bad decade followed by slow growth, they're projected to still have 1.5 million. And what I often talk to my clients about is I don't think the goal for many of us is to die with $10 million in our portfolio, right? The goal is how can we spend our money to live our best life and do the things we love to do with the people we care most about. And if leaving money behind to family or a charity is important to you, great, we can add that into the plan. But my point is, this is where we get to have really fun conversations and ask ourselves, well, can we retire at 62 rather than 65? What does that look like? What if we budgeted an extra 1,000 or two a month so you can pay for a private health insurance policy before Medicare kicks in and fill that health insurance gap? And yes, they'd have 4 million less in assets, but they're projected to still be on track. What if we said, hey, Ken and Beth, what if you retired today? Can we make it happen? And the answer is yes. Now, they'd have $7 million less in their plan, but you'd still be on track and would be able to make it work. Now, this doesn't mean Ken and Beth are turning in their notices tomorrow, but just knowing that they'd be okay financially if they stopped working right now lifts a huge burden off their shoulders, knowing that if at any point a health issue comes up, or if there was a family member that needed care and some help, they would have the option to confidently step away from work and take care of what was important at that given point in time. Now, what if we went back to the original plan, working to age 65, because maybe Ken and Beth enjoy their work, but they still want to look at different scenarios? What if they were to spend $7,500 per month, so an extra $24,000 per year? Well, they can totally do that. It would have a minimal impact on their overall plan. They just have $3 million less in assets in their late 90s. Now, another thing Ken and Beth mentioned that was important to them was helping their kids fund their grandchildren's college education without putting their own retirement at risk. Let's say they had three grandchildren. What if you could put 5,000 per year for each of them into 529 plans until the last grandchild goes to college in 15 years? So that would be $15,000 per year, 5,000 a year for each of the three grandkids. Let's see what happens if they did this. Now again, they would have 5 million less, but the plan would work out just fine. And that's in addition to living on 7,500 a month in retirement. So they would still be in a very strong place. So the goal isn't to say, Ken and Beth, here's exactly what you need to do for the rest of your life. The goal of this is to spark conversations about the possibilities of what you can do in retirement. Conversations that maybe you haven't really had before in figuring out what you want retirement to actually look like. So, how do you want to spend your time or what's important to you? And we continue from here with Ken and Beth in discussing how do we maximize your tax strategy? How do we make sure you have the right insurance in place or make sure your estate plan is set up correctly? All of these topics stem from the base plan that we just put together, but we continue to make small changes to align everything with your vision for your own retirement. Now, you might be watching this video and saying, wow, that looks great, but now you're asking yourself, which retirement accounts should I withdraw money from first in retirement to do all these cool things I want to do? I have 401ks, IRAs, and brokerage accounts. Where should I pull the income from first, and how will the taxes impact my plan? Well, in this video, I'll show you the best strategy to structure your retirement income and where to pull that money from first in retirement. So I invite you to check it out. Once again, I'm Tom, the founder of GT Wealth, and if you're interested in seeing how we help our clients live their best life in retirement, visit us at www.gtwealthguide.com. Thanks for watching.